The courtroom was unnervingly quiet. The air was thick with tension, as every person present hung on Officer Grant Turner's every word. The tall, muscular officer stood at the witness stand in his crisp police uniform, his voice firm and unwavering. "I saw her break into that store with my own eyes," he declared, his words slicing through the silence. "She had a crowbar, pried open the door, and ran off with a bag of stolen goods. That's her, Your Honor. I swear on my badge." A ripple of shock passed through the courtroom. The judge, an older man with a stern face, turned to the defendant, his gaze heavy. Rebecca Larson sat calmly at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her face was a mask of calm, but inside she was calculating her next move. Dressed in a simple white blouse and navy pants, she looked every bit the ordinary citizen. But her posture, the way her eyes remained fixed on Officer Turner, made it clear she was anything but ordinary. The prosecutor, sensing an easy victory, stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, it's clear as day. A respected officer of the law has witnessed this woman committing the crime. What more do we need?" The judge's cold gaze shifted to Rebecca. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Miss Larson?" he asked, his voice stern. Rebecca rose slowly from her seat. Her movements were calm, almost deliberate, betraying no sign of the storm she carried within. She adjusted her blouse, took a deep breath, and then spoke in a clear, measured tone. "Your Honor," she began, "Officer Turner has made a terrible mistake. He's lying under oath, and he doesn't even realize it." A murmur of disbelief spread through the room. Turner's face went pale, and he blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order. "Order! Order in the court!" Rebecca turned her gaze from Turner to the judge. "I am not just any woman, Your Honor," she continued, her voice unwavering. "I am a Navy SEAL, a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and I am here to tell you the truth. Officer Turner is wrong about me." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Whispers spread like wildfire, and even the prosecutor's confident smirk faltered. Officer Turner stood frozen, struggling to process the bombshell Rebecca had just dropped. The judge, seemingly taken aback, narrowed his eyes at her, trying to assess the gravity of what she had just said. Rebecca wasn't done yet. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, holding it up for everyone to see. "I have evidence, Your Honor," she said coolly. "My body cam was running the entire time. It recorded everything. If you play it, you'll see the truth." The judge nodded, signaling for the court clerk to retrieve the necessary equipment. The prosecutor's confidence had vanished. He stepped back, his face clouded with uncertainty. "We don't need to see any more of your evidence, Miss Larson," he said, though it was clear that his words lacked conviction. "Play it," the judge ordered, his tone final. The clerk swiftly connected the USB to the courtroom's projector, and the screen flickered to life. The footage began to play. The first shot showed Rebecca walking down the street, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. The camera followed her as she approached a small convenience store, where a young boy was sitting on the curb, looking distressed. Rebecca's expression softened as she crouched next to him, speaking to him gently. "I lost my money," the boy whispered, his voice small and defeated. Rebecca glanced through the store's window, where the cashier watched them with a suspicious gaze. She smiled at the boy, offering a comforting hand. "Are you hungry?" she asked. The boy nodded shyly, and Rebecca led him inside the store, where he picked out a sandwich, a bottle of milk, and an apple. Rebecca paid for the food, gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder, and they left. It was then that the video took a sharp turn. Officer Turner's cruiser screeched to a halt outside the store, and he stepped out, his expression hard. "You! Stop right there!" he commanded, marching toward Rebecca. The footage showed Rebecca's confused expression as Turner immediately pulled out his handcuffs. "You're under arrest. Witnesses saw a woman matching your description breaking into this store earlier," he said. "You're coming with me." Rebecca's eyes narrowed as she tried to reason with him. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. But Turner wasn't listening. He grabbed her arms roughly and snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists. The young boy, still standing nearby, shouted, "She didn't do anything! She was helping me!" But Turner ignored him, pushing Rebecca toward the squad car. As they reached the car, Rebecca's mind raced. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something much bigger. And she was going to figure out exactly what was going on. The footage continued, and just before Turner arrived, a shadowy figure was seen moving behind the store. The figure, wearing a police badge, lingered just out of sight. Rebecca's eyes darted toward the screen. It was clear that Turner wasn't just making a mistake. He was covering for someone higher up. The courtroom was silent as the footage came to a halt. Rebecca's gaze never left Officer Turner. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cold and unwavering, "I believe we have more than one liar in this courtroom." The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Officer Turner," he said, his voice stern, "you have a lot of explaining to do." Turner opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The courtroom was on edge, and everyone could feel the shift in power. Rebecca had just turned the entire case on its head. Rebecca Larson's mind raced as she sat in the back of the police cruiser, the cold metal cuffs biting into her wrists. She stared out the window, watching the city blur by in the silence that enveloped the car. The young boy's voice echoed in her ears, pleading for her innocence, but Officer Turner had already made his decision. He wasn't listening. Her mind swirled with questions. Why had Turner arrested her? There had to be more to this than a simple case of mistaken identity. She wasn't some petty thief. She wasn't someone who broke into stores. So why was she being treated like a criminal? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a random mistake. Someone was pulling strings. She glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Turner's tense profile. The officer's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his face locked in grim concentration. But Rebecca could see it in his eyes. Doubt. He wasn't sure why he was doing this either. Something was wrong, and Rebecca knew that his actions weren't his own. The cruiser made a sharp turn onto a quiet street, pulling up to a small, dimly lit precinct. Turner parked the car in the lot and got out without saying a word. He motioned for Rebecca to step out, his hand gripping his baton tightly. "Come on," he muttered, barely looking at her as he pulled open the back door. Rebecca complied, her heart pounding in her chest, but her movements were calm and measured. As Turner moved to open the trunk of the cruiser, she quickly surveyed her surroundings. She was too aware of how vulnerable she was at the moment, yet something deep inside her told her she wasn't about to go down without a fight. This wasn't a random arrest. Someone was behind this, and she needed to figure out who. Turner shoved her toward the entrance of the precinct, his hand on her arm, his grip tightening. As they walked through the door, the small, sterile room seemed to close in on her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an uncomfortable glow. A single officer sat at a desk, tapping away at a computer, barely glancing up as Rebecca was escorted past him. Turner led her down a narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. They stopped in front of a small, dimly lit room, a holding cell. The heavy metal door creaked as Turner opened it and pushed her inside. Rebecca stumbled, but caught herself, glaring at the officer. "You've got the wrong woman," she said, her voice cold and steady. "This isn't what you think." Turner didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked out, slamming the door behind him. She heard his footsteps fade as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving her alone in the small, windowless cell. The sound of her heartbeat was deafening in the silence. She ran her hands through her hair, pacing the small room. She had to find out who was behind this. Whoever was pulling the strings had a reason for targeting her, and she wasn't going to sit in this cell and wait to find out. Not without a fight. Rebecca's training as a Navy SEAL had taught her how to handle pressure, how to keep her cool in situations where others would panic. She had been in far more dangerous situations than this, but something about this felt different. The pieces didn't fit. She had to be missing something. She moved to the corner of the room, sitting down on the cold concrete floor. Her mind raced, but she focused on what she knew. Turner had been so sure of his accusation, but there had been something in his eyes when she'd confronted him. Doubt. She had seen it in the way he hesitated when he slapped the cuffs on her. He didn't believe she was guilty. No, he was just following orders. And that meant someone else was behind this. A few minutes passed before the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Rebecca's instincts kicked in. She rose to her feet, her muscles tensing. She didn't know who was coming, but she wasn't about to take any chances. The door opened, and a new figure stepped inside. A tall, well-dressed man with a cold expression. His dark eyes fixed on Rebecca as he leaned against the doorframe. "Miss Larson," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I think it's time we had a little talk." Rebecca sized him up. This wasn't Turner. Whoever this man was, he wasn't part of the usual precinct staff. His air of authority, the way he carried himself, it was clear he was important, and likely involved in something much larger than a simple arrest. "I'm listening," Rebecca replied, her tone icy. The man didn't seem fazed by her defiant attitude. He smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Agent Ryan Cole," he introduced himself, his voice measured. "And I'm afraid you've found yourself tangled up in something bigger than you can imagine." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat at the mention of bigger. She knew that whatever was going on, it was no accident. This wasn't some random mistake. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but she needed more. "What do you want?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. She was done with vague answers. She needed facts. "Easy," Cole said, his smile widening just a little. "I want to know why a decorated Navy SEAL like you is walking the streets and getting involved in a petty crime like this. You've got connections, Larson, and people like you, well, they don't just vanish when someone points a finger." Rebecca clenched her fists, trying to suppress the surge of anger that bubbled up inside her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Oh, I think you do," Cole replied, his smile widening. "But I'll let you figure that out on your own." He turned and walked out of the cell, leaving Rebecca alone once more. As the door slammed shut behind him, Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever this man was, he was connected to something dangerous. She could feel it. And now, she was even more determined to find out what that something was. Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had been in tight spots before, but this situation felt different. The man, Agent Ryan Cole, had dropped a bombshell, and the uncertainty of it all gnawed at her. He wasn't just some officer. He was someone high up, someone with authority. But who was he working for? And why was she being dragged into this mess? The next few hours passed in a haze. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, making it hard to focus on anything for too long. Rebecca had been left alone in the small holding cell, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to piece together what she had learned. She was used to investigating, to figuring things out under pressure, but this felt like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Around midnight, the door to the cell clicked open, and Rebecca snapped her attention to the sound. Turner stepped in, his face drawn and tired. He didn't look at her immediately, instead turning his attention to the folder he held in his hand. The silence stretched for a moment before he spoke. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "None of this was supposed to happen." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. She knew that tone, the tone of someone who wasn't in control. "What's going on, Turner?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Who's pulling your strings? What did you get yourself involved in?" Turner looked at her, his face pained. He didn't answer at first, instead pacing the room, clearly agitated. Finally, he sighed and dropped the folder onto the small table beside her. "I don't know what you know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm in deep. They've got me by the throat." Rebecca leaned forward, trying to make sense of his words. "Who are they? And why the hell did you arrest me? I didn't do anything wrong." Turner ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling. "I didn't want to arrest you, but the people I'm working for, they don't give you a choice. They told me to make you disappear. They said you were a threat. But I didn't know who you were until now. I should have figured it out." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. This wasn't about a petty crime. This was about something much bigger. And now she was caught in the crossfire. "Who are these people, Turner?" she demanded. Turner didn't answer right away, his eyes darting to the door as though expecting someone to walk in at any moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low, barely above a whisper. "The Black Vipers," he said, the words feeling like a punch to the gut. "They run things in this city. They've got people everywhere, inside the police force, inside the government, you name it. And if you cross them, you're as good as dead." Rebecca's mind was already spinning. The Black Vipers, she had heard whispers about them, but never anything concrete. They were an underground network of criminals, people who controlled the city from the shadows. But what did they want with her? What had she done to get caught in their sights? Turner seemed to notice her confusion. He leaned against the wall, his posture defeated. "You were never supposed to be involved, Larson. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now they've made it personal." Rebecca's pulse quickened. The Black Vipers were more than just a street gang. They were a criminal syndicate, a network that had roots deep within the city. And now, somehow, she had become a part of their game. A door opened down the hall, and Turner quickly stepped back from the table, his posture shifting back to the formal stance of an officer. Rebecca followed his eyes and saw another man approaching, Agent Cole. His cold expression never wavered as he stepped into the room. "Turner," Cole said with a brief nod, before turning his attention to Rebecca. "Miss Larson, we need to talk." Rebecca stood up, her hands still bound by the cuffs. She wasn't afraid of Cole, but she knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. "What is it you want from me?" she asked, her tone flat. "You've got me here. You've got Turner wrapped around your finger. What's your game?" Cole's lips twisted into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're smarter than you look," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually. You've got a good mind, Larson. But that's not why you're here." Rebecca's mind raced. "Then why am I here, Cole? What's your angle?" "You're here because we need you to help us clean up a mess," Cole said simply. "The Black Vipers are no longer a local problem. They've spread out. They've infiltrated more than just law enforcement. We're talking about a network that reaches into the highest offices in this city. People with power, people who are untouchable. And they've made a deal with someone who has the kind of influence that could bring down everything. Rebecca felt a chill run through her. "Who are you working for?" she asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it. Cole leaned in, his eyes cold and unflinching. "Let's just say I work for people who want the same thing you do. Justice. But we need your help, Larson. You're in this now, whether you like it or not. And if you want to walk out of here, you'll help us expose them." Rebecca didn't respond immediately. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Justice. She had no love for the system she was forced to rely on, but she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than that. The Black Vipers weren't just criminals. They were a cancer in the system, a cancer that needed to be eradicated. "Okay," she said at last, her voice steady. "I'll help. But you need to understand something. If I'm going to do this, I do it on my terms, and I won't be anyone's pawn." Cole's expression never changed. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Larson," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "But you'll need to trust us. We're all in this together now." Rebecca sat in the cold, sterile room, her mind racing with the weight of what Agent Cole had revealed. The Black Vipers, a criminal syndicate that had infiltrated every level of law enforcement and government, were now connected to her life in ways she never imagined. Cole's words rang in her ears. "If you want to walk out of here, you'll help us expose them." The door to the room opened, and Turner stepped in. He glanced at Rebecca, his face pale, his eyes filled with guilt. He avoided her gaze, unable to meet her eyes for long. His silence spoke volumes. "You didn't want this," Rebecca said, her voice low but firm. "But you're in this now, Turner. The Black Vipers, what do they have on you?" Turner shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't a man who was easily rattled, but the pressure of the situation was getting to him. "I told you before," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They've got my brother. They're holding him. If I don't do what they say, they'll kill him." Rebecca's brow furrowed. "So they've got leverage over you. But why drag me into this? What do you think I can do?" Turner hesitated before answering. "I didn't know it was you. If I had, maybe I wouldn't have gone through with it. But they made it clear. You're a threat, and they don't care who gets hurt. They just want you out of the picture. They have connections everywhere." Rebecca stood up, pacing the small room, her mind churning. "You're in deeper than you think, Turner. We all are now. And if you don't start helping me, things will get worse for both of us." There was a long pause before Turner finally spoke again. "They've already made a move against me," he said quietly. "Agent Cole. He's not just some government agent. He's one of them." Rebecca's stomach twisted. She turned to face Turner, her eyes narrowed. "Are you saying Cole is part of the Black Vipers?" Turner nodded, looking around nervously before leaning in closer. "He's been playing both sides. He's the one pulling the strings from the inside. He's the reason I'm here, why I had to arrest you, why I've been forced to cover up what they're doing. He's their way into everything, from law enforcement to politics. He's the bridge." Rebecca's mind spun, her pulse quickening. She had trusted Cole, or at least thought she could. If he was a double agent, everything she'd known about this operation had just been turned upside down. Her plan to expose the Black Vipers had just gotten infinitely more complicated. The door opened again, and Cole stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him with a soft click and turned to face Rebecca, his gaze cold as always. "Turner," Cole said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of menace, "you've said enough. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. "So it's true," she said, her voice sharp. "You've been working with them all along. You're part of the Black Vipers." Cole's lips curled into a faint, almost predatory smile. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Larson," he replied, his tone smooth and calculated. "I'm simply doing what needs to be done to get results. We're all on the same team now, whether you like it or not." Rebecca stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. "You think this is just a game? These people you're protecting? They're killers. They ruin lives. They run this city from the shadows. And you're helping them." Cole's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm protecting my own interests, Larson. That's what anyone does in this world. You should understand that by now." Rebecca's fingers clenched into fists at her sides, her breath quickening. She could feel the anger building within her, the realization of how deep the corruption ran. She wasn't just fighting criminals anymore. She was up against an entire system, and Cole was a part of that system. "I won't be your pawn," she said, her voice low but filled with deadly resolve. "You're going down with them." Cole's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something dark in his eyes, something that sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. "I think you misunderstand your position here," he said, stepping closer. "You don't get to make demands. You're in my hands now. I hold the cards." Rebecca didn't flinch. She had faced tougher opponents than Cole. "You don't hold anything over me," she said coolly. "I don't fear you, and I don't fear the Black Vipers. This ends with me taking them down, one way or another." Cole's smile faded as he sized her up, taking a step back. "We'll see how long that attitude lasts when the Black Vipers come knocking at your door. They don't take kindly to defiance." Rebecca wasn't intimidated. She had trained for situations like this, and she had no intention of letting Cole or the Black Vipers win. "I don't need to worry about them. They're going to wish they never crossed me." Cole turned to Turner, nodding for him to leave. "Take her back to her cell," he said, his voice cold. "We'll continue this little conversation soon enough." Turner gave Rebecca a look of regret before turning to leave. He didn't want to be involved in this any longer, but it was too late for him to back out. As he led her down the hallway toward the holding cells, Rebecca's mind was already working, her thoughts racing faster than her heart could beat. She needed to find a way out of this trap, before Cole and the Black Vipers could bury her for good. The fluorescent lights flickered as Rebecca sat in her small, dimly lit cell, her back against the cold concrete wall. Time had lost all meaning. The minutes stretched into hours, and the only sound that filled her ears was the faint hum of the air conditioning. She had tried to stay calm, but her mind was racing, thinking through her options, calculating the best way out of the mess she was in. Agent Cole and the Black Vipers had her cornered, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. The realization that Cole had been working with them, playing both sides, left a bitter taste in her mouth. He was supposed to be someone she could trust, but now she understood the grim truth. Nothing in this city was what it seemed. She knew she couldn't stay in this holding cell forever. She needed to escape, and she needed to get to the bottom of what the Black Vipers were planning. They were everywhere, pulling strings in the police force, the government, and the streets. But they didn't control her. Not yet. Rebecca had spent too many years in special forces, too many years operating in the shadows, to let herself be caught in a trap. She had dealt with corrupt systems before, but this was different. The Black Vipers were far more powerful, and they weren't going to let her walk away once they realized she was a threat. A sudden sound broke her concentration, the sound of heavy boots echoing down the hallway. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She stood quickly, her instincts kicking in. She wasn't waiting for anyone to come to her. She was getting out, and now was her chance. The door to the cell opened with a metallic screech, and a uniformed officer stepped inside. It wasn't Turner. It was another officer, one she hadn't seen before. He glanced at her briefly before speaking. "Time to move," the officer said, his voice flat and emotionless. Rebecca's stomach tightened. This was it. She wasn't being moved for a friendly chat. She was being moved for something far worse. She kept her expression neutral as she stepped forward, but inside, every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to act. The officer moved to handcuff her, but Rebecca was faster. With a swift motion, she twisted her body, using the momentum of his approach to her advantage. She spun behind him, grabbing his arm and pulling him off balance. Before he could react, she shoved him against the wall, the sharp crack of his skull hitting the concrete, echoing in the hallway. She didn't hesitate. The officer crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Rebecca grabbed his keys and, with a practiced motion, unlocked the handcuffs from her wrists. She was free, at least for now, but she knew that the moment she stepped out of the cell, the clock would start ticking. She darted down the hallway, moving quickly but silently. She had no idea where she was going, but the one thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't stay in the building. She had to get outside, away from the eyes of the black vipers and the law enforcement that was either complicit or unaware of their power. Rebecca rounded a corner and froze, her breath catching in her throat. Ahead of her, she saw a group of guards moving in her direction. They hadn't seen her yet, but it wouldn't take long for them to notice that an officer had been knocked out cold. She couldn't take them all down without making noise. There was a door to her left, and without thinking, Rebecca sprinted toward it. She yanked it open and slipped through, her heart pounding. The door led to a small storage room. It was dark, but she didn't have time to waste. She needed to figure out a plan, and fast. Her mind raced as she crouched behind a stack of boxes, listening carefully. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and she knew she couldn't stay hidden for much longer. She needed a way out, and she needed it now. Then it hit her. The back exit. She had seen it when they brought her in, a small service door that led to the parking lot behind the precinct. If she could get there without being seen, she could make her escape. Rebecca checked the door, holding her breath. It was unlocked. Her pulse quickened, but she remained calm. Every movement had to be precise. Every step had to be calculated. She opened the door slowly, just enough to slip through. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of danger. The parking lot was empty, save for a few cars. She didn't see anyone watching, but that didn't mean she was in the clear. Not yet. Rebecca crept across the lot, moving between the parked cars like a shadow. She had to stay out of sight. As she approached the fence at the far end of the lot, she saw the flicker of headlights. Her stomach dropped. It was a squad car, and it was heading straight for the entrance. She had no choice but to make a run for it. The fence was a few yards away, and she had to get there before they saw her. Rebecca sprinted, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder. She reached the fence, grabbing the metal with both hands and pulling herself up with the strength of someone who had been trained for moments, just like this. The sound of the squad car grew louder, but she was already halfway over the fence. Her boots hit the ground on the other side with a soft thud, and she immediately dropped into a crouch. Her eyes scanned the area. The street was quiet, but she knew she didn't have much time. She had to get out of the city, far away from the precinct, and figure out her next move. She was no longer just trying to survive. She was hunting the black vipers, and she would not stop until they were taken down. As she vanished into the shadows, Rebecca knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Rebecca kept her head down as she navigated through the darkened city streets, the weight of the night pressing on her. Her pulse was still racing from her escape, the adrenaline from the chase keeping her sharp. But she knew this wasn't over. It had just begun. She couldn't afford to be caught now. Not after everything that had happened. Not after what she had learned about the Black Vipers. She moved swiftly, her mind working through the next steps. She needed to find a safe place, something off the grid, where she could regroup and start piecing together the puzzle. The Black Vipers weren't just a street gang. They were a criminal empire, controlling everything from drug trafficking to arms deals, with deep roots in law enforcement and government. If she was going to take them down, she had to be smart. She had to be strategic. The city's underbelly was vast, and Rebecca knew it well from her time overseas, hunting down dangerous syndicates and criminals. But this was different. The Black Vipers were far more organized, far more dangerous, and they had eyes everywhere. She slipped into a rundown building, taking the back entrance into a narrow hallway. Her contacts had been scattered, but she still had a few reliable ones in the city. She needed information. Fast. Someone had to know something about the Black Vipers' operations, where they were hiding, who their top players were, and who was pulling the strings. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize. Her instincts told her to ignore it, but something inside told her not to. With a sharp exhale, she answered. "Larson," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Who's this?" The voice on the other end was distorted, masked. "You're a hard person to reach, Larson," the voice said, smooth and cold. "But I've got something that might interest you. Something you'll want to hear." Rebecca's instincts kicked into overdrive. "What do you know?" "I know you're looking for the Black Vipers," the voice continued, "and I can help you find them. But we need to make a deal." Rebecca paused, her mind processing the offer. Who was this person? Someone who knew about the Vipers' operations. Someone who was willing to make a deal with her. But deals came at a cost. "What's your price?" she asked, her voice low. "Information," the voice replied. "I want you to take down a specific part of the Vipers' network, a specific operation they've got running. You do that, and I'll give you what you need to find their headquarters. You'll know exactly where to go, who's in charge, everything." Rebecca's gut told her that this was too easy, but she didn't have the luxury of turning down leads. The Black Vipers had been a ghost in the city, operating in the shadows for too long. If she had the chance to get closer to taking them down, she couldn't let it slip away. "What's the catch?" she asked, already knowing there was more to the deal. "There's always a catch," the voice said, almost in amusement. "You'll have to go in alone. No backup. And you'll have to trust me. The Vipers don't leave anything to chance. They'll be watching you. They'll know you're coming." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "What's the operation?" she asked, keeping her tone steady. "The Black Vipers are running an arms deal tomorrow night at Pier 19. You disrupt that, you get the information you need. But if you fail, well, let's just say there's no coming back from that." Rebecca's mind spun as she processed the offer. An arms deal? At Pier 19? That was a major operation. It would involve some serious firepower, but this could be her chance to get to the heart of the Black Vipers network. She didn't have time to waste. She was already on their radar, and if she didn't act quickly, they'd close in on her. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "I'll take the deal. But if you're lying to me—" "I'm not lying," the voice interrupted. "But if you don't succeed, there's no telling what will happen. You've been warned." The line went dead before Rebecca could respond. She stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She couldn't back down now. The Black Vipers had made it personal. They'd tried to take her out before, and they wouldn't stop until she was out of the picture. This was her chance to get back at them, and maybe even find out who was truly behind the operation. The next night, Rebecca found herself crouched behind a rusted shipping container at Pier 19. The salty air mixed with the sounds of the water lapping against the docks and the creaks of ships settling in the harbor. It was quiet. Too quiet. The area was dark, illuminated only by flickering overhead lights that cast long shadows across the pier. She could hear the faint sounds of men talking in the distance, but she didn't move. Not yet. She had spent the day preparing. She'd scouted the area, memorized the layout, and tracked the movements of the guards. She knew this operation wasn't going to be easy. The Black Vipers weren't stupid. They would have security, and they would be expecting trouble. Rebecca checked the small pouch at her waist, ensuring she had the equipment she needed: flashbangs, a silenced pistol, a knife, and a small explosive device for taking down a door or blocking an escape route. She was ready. She glanced at her watch, 11:57 p.m. The deal would be starting soon. This was it. She had to get in, disrupt the deal, and get the information she needed. The Black Viper's empire was about to come crumbling down, and Rebecca Larson was the one who was going to bring it all crashing down. Rebecca crouched behind the rusted container, her breath steady, but her pulse pounding in her ears. The shadows stretched out before her, hiding the men she could hear talking just ahead. She wasn't alone at Pier 19. The Black Vipers were here, and she was about to crash their party. She checked the time again. Midnight was approaching. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the area. It wasn't just a few men. There were at least a dozen scattered around the pier, all armed, all on edge. She could make out their silhouettes in the dim light, moving between crates and shipping containers, eyes sharp for any signs of danger. This wasn't just a run-of-the-mill arms deal. This was big. This was the Black Vipers flexing their muscle, showing how deeply embedded they were in the city's underworld. Rebecca adjusted the straps on her gear, pulling her jacket tighter around her body. Every movement had to be calculated. She had no room for error. The man she'd spoken to earlier, the one who had given her the tip-off, had been vague about the details, but one thing was clear. If she didn't stop this deal, the Black Vipers would only grow stronger. The arms deal tonight was just one part of their operation, and she needed to know who was backing them, who was protecting them from the law. She could hear voices getting closer. They were talking in low tones, probably discussing the deal. She didn't have much time. She had to move. She carefully unhooked one of her flashbangs from her belt and primed it, slipping it into her pocket. The element of surprise was key. Rebecca crept forward, moving quietly but quickly. She rounded a corner, slipping between the shadows of two large containers, and finally, she saw them. 3 men stood around a large wooden crate, their faces obscured by the darkness. The deal was about to go down, and Rebecca couldn't let it happen. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as she reached for the flashbang. With precision, she pulled the pin and threw it toward the group of men. The grenade landed with a soft thud, and then, boom! A flash of bright light filled the air, followed by a deafening bang. The men recoiled in shock, and Rebecca was already on the move. She drew her silenced pistol, firing 2 quick shots at the closest man, sending him to the ground without a sound. The others were still dazed from the flashbang, trying to recover their bearings. She didn't give them a chance. She dropped the second man with a shot to the chest, and the third stumbled back in confusion, reaching for his weapon. He never had the chance to pull it. Rebecca lunged forward, slamming her knee into his stomach and knocking him out cold with a swift blow to the head. She wasted no time. She made her way to the crate the men had been standing around, her eyes scanning the contents. It was packed with military-grade weapons, rifles, grenades, ammo. A significant haul. But this wasn't what interested Rebecca. She was after information, and there was something hidden beneath the surface of this deal. As she checked the crate, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. More men were coming. She needed to get out. Fast. Before she could retreat, a shadowy figure emerged from behind the containers, and Rebecca froze. It was another man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially covered by a mask. He wasn't one of the men from the deal, but his presence here meant he was part of the operation. Without hesitation, Rebecca raised her weapon, her finger tight on the trigger. But before she could fire, the man spoke. "Don't bother, Larson. You won't get away." Her heart skipped a beat. He knew her name. "How do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. The man's lips curled into a grin, but there was no warmth behind it. "I know everything about you," he said, stepping closer. "And you've made a grave mistake tonight. You think you're taking down the Black Vipers, but what you don't know is they're not the real power in this city." Rebecca narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "You and your people are nothing but a bunch of criminals. Who's really pulling the strings?" The man chuckled darkly. "You're asking the right questions, but the answers are bigger than you can imagine." Before Rebecca could respond, a voice called out from the distance. The sound of more footsteps, the backup she had been expecting. The man in front of her took one last look, his eyes cold and calculating. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "But it won't be in time to stop what's coming." With that, he turned and vanished into the shadows. Rebecca's mind raced as the footsteps grew louder. She had just been given a clue, a hint of something far bigger than she had anticipated. The Black Vipers might have been running the show on the streets, but there was someone, or something, more powerful behind them. Someone with even greater influence. The men coming for her weren't just regular thugs. They were the elite. They had been trained, ready for someone like her to come along. She wasn't going to escape without a fight, but this time she had no choice but to leave. The clues she had gathered tonight were too important. She needed to dig deeper into this mystery. The Black Vipers were only a small piece of the puzzle. With a quick glance back at the crate, Rebecca turned and sprinted toward the shadows, her feet pounding against the wet pavement. She didn't look back. She had a lot of work to do, and time was running out. Rebecca darted between containers, her breath coming in short bursts as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. She had already taken out a few of the Black Viper's men, but there was no time to linger. The intel she had just learned, the mention of someone pulling the strings from behind the scenes, was far too important to ignore. She needed to figure out who this shadowy figure was and what role they played in the bigger picture. And she couldn't do that if she was caught. As she neared the end of the pier, Rebecca's hand went to her earpiece. "Ethan, I need an extraction. Now." Her trusted ally, Ethan Hayes, had been her backup for years, ever since their time together in the field. He was a former FBI agent, a man with the kind of expertise that could be invaluable in situations like this, and if anyone could get her out of a tight spot, it was him. There was a brief pause, and then his voice crackled through the earpiece. "On my way. Head for the old warehouse, behind the docks. I'll be there in 5. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She ran toward the far end of the pier, keeping her movements smooth and quick. Her training kicked in, allowing her to cover ground without making a sound. Her eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, her instincts telling her that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder. 2 men were following her. They weren't making any noise, but she could tell they were closing in. A quick calculation ran through her mind. She wasn't about to be chased off the pier like a scared animal. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. Rebecca reached the old warehouse just as the men caught up to her. She ducked inside, finding temporary cover behind a stack of crates. Her pulse remained steady, her breath even, but the tension in the air was undeniable. She wasn't sure how many men were with them, but she knew it wouldn't be long before they surrounded her. She had no choice but to fight. The footsteps outside the warehouse grew louder, and Rebecca's hand instinctively went to her pistol. She had to move quickly. The first man entered the warehouse, his eyes scanning the shadows. Rebecca remained still, calculating her move. He stepped closer to her hiding spot, his gun raised. Before he could react, she lunged from her position, driving her elbow into his chest and knocking the wind out of him. As he staggered back, she reached for his weapon, disarming him with a swift motion. With a hard twist, she slammed him into the nearest crate, knocking him out cold. The second man, hearing the noise, entered the warehouse with his gun drawn. But he wasn't fast enough. Rebecca grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it toward him, hitting him across the face with enough force to send him sprawling to the ground. Breathing heavily, Rebecca stood over the 2 men, her chest rising and falling with the effort. That was too close. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. Ethan would be here soon, but she had no idea what was waiting for her once she got out of the warehouse. The Black Vipers weren't just going to let her walk away, not after what she'd done tonight. A low, rumbling sound reached her ears. A car engine. Ethan was close. She ducked out of the warehouse and sprinted toward the alleyway behind it. Her eyes scanned the street ahead, and sure enough, she saw Ethan's car coming around the corner. He slowed to a stop, the tires screeching as he pulled up to the curb. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She jumped into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. Ethan gunned the engine, and they tore off into the night, the sound of their tires skidding on the wet asphalt, echoing in the streets. "Good to see you made it out in one piece," Ethan said, his voice a mix of concern and approval. He was focused on the road, his hands gripping the wheel with practiced ease. Rebecca exhaled slowly. "It's not over yet," she said, her eyes fixed on the dark streets ahead. "We've got a bigger problem now. The Black Vipers are just the tip of the iceberg." Ethan glanced at her. "You're not wrong. The way those men were organized, this isn't just a gang. They've got someone behind them, someone bigger." Rebecca nodded. "I found out a bit more tonight. Whoever is pulling the strings, they're operating out of sight. But the Black Vipers? They're just the muscle. The real power is in the government." Ethan frowned, clearly not expecting that answer. "You're saying the Vipers are just a front? For something bigger?" Rebecca's gaze hardened. "Exactly. They've got connections in law enforcement, in politics. It's deeper than we thought. There's someone in power protecting them, and I need to find out who." Ethan was quiet for a moment, the wheels turning in his mind. "I think I might know someone who can help with that. But if we're going after this, we need to be ready for whatever comes next. This isn't going to be a simple takedown." Rebecca didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." The cars zipped through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic, as Rebecca and Ethan set their sights on taking down the people behind the Black Vipers. The stakes were higher than ever, and Rebecca knew that the closer they got to uncovering the truth, the more dangerous it would become. But she wasn't backing down. They had crossed a line now, and there was no turning back. The night was thick with tension, the city alive with the hum of late-night traffic and the soft rustle of the wind through the alleyways. Rebecca's mind raced as Ethan drove them through the winding streets toward their next destination. She knew the Black Vipers were closing in on her, and the clock was ticking. But what had become clear was that this wasn't just about a gang. It wasn't even about a corrupt system. It was about an empire, an underground network of power, corruption, and brutality. As the car sped through the empty streets, Rebecca glanced at Ethan. His jaw was clenched, his focus on the road. He'd been with her through this entire mess, and now he was more determined than ever. But the question remained. Who was at the top? Who was orchestrating everything from the shadows? Ethan, Rebecca said, breaking the silence. I know you're thinking it, but we don't have time to waste. We need to hit them hard. Find out who's really pulling the strings. Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off the road. I know. We can't let this go on any longer. We hit them where it hurts. They turned a corner and pulled up to a nondescript building tucked away in an industrial part of town. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen life in years. This was their target. A warehouse where they'd traced the Black Vipers' operations to their roots. But Rebecca knew it wasn't just the Vipers who were in control here. There was a bigger player, a politician with power far beyond what she'd ever imagined. Get ready, Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency. This is where it all ends. Rebecca pushed open the car door and stepped into the night. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins as they moved toward the warehouse. The city was silent around them, but Rebecca knew that wasn't going to last. They were about to stir up a hornet's nest, and the Black Vipers wouldn't go down without a fight. As they neared the warehouse, Rebecca's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings. The place was well guarded, heavily reinforced, but nothing was going to stop her now. 2 guards at the entrance, Rebecca muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. They won't see us coming. Ethan gave a small nod, and together they moved into position. They had trained for moments like this, swift, silent, precise. Rebecca moved like a shadow, her movements controlled and efficient. Ethan was right behind her, his gaze scanning for any sign of danger. They approached the 2 guards, their backs turned. The first man went down with a single swift punch to the back of his neck, and the second man was taken out just as easily. Both were unconscious before they even realized what had happened. The door to the warehouse was unguarded, and they slipped inside without a sound. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and dust. Rebecca could hear the sound of voices echoing off the walls, men laughing, talking, planning. She had to get closer. They moved deeper into the building, avoiding detection. The Black Vipers had been using the warehouse as a storage and distribution hub for their illegal arms deals. But Rebecca was more interested in what they were hiding, the true power behind their operation. They reached the far end of the warehouse, and that's when Rebecca saw him, the man she'd been hunting for, Senator Richard Kane. He stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 heavily armed bodyguards. Kane was tall, well-dressed, his posture regal. His presence commanded the room, and for a moment, Rebecca felt the weight of the power he held. Ethan tensed beside her. That's him! The man behind all of this. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. We end it here. She moved forward, her steps light and silent. But Kane saw her coming. His eyes locked onto hers, a glint of recognition flashing in his cold gaze. I wondered how long it would take before you found me, Larson, he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. You're a lot tougher than I gave you credit for. Rebecca didn't flinch. She stepped into the open, her weapon drawn. This ends tonight, Kane. Kane's smirk faded as he took a step back, signaling to his guards. The two men moved into position, weapons raised, but Rebecca was faster. She fired 2 shots, one to each of their chests, dropping them before they had a chance to react. Kane didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small device, pressing a button with a deliberate calmness. "You think you've won, Larson?" he said, his voice low and chilling. "This is just the beginning. You've been playing right into my hands." Rebecca's mind raced. "What are you talking about? Your little game with the Black Vipers?" Kane's lips curled into a cruel smile. "That's just a distraction. The real power is right under your nose. You've already met him, Agent Cole. He's been my man on the inside, and now you're standing here, thinking you've won. But you haven't even scratched the surface." Rebecca's stomach twisted as realization hit her like a punch. Cole had been working for Kane all along. And the Black Vipers? They were just pawns in a much larger game. Before she could respond, Kane pressed the button again, and the sound of distant sirens echoed through the warehouse. "You've just made a mistake, Larson. My people are everywhere. This is where it all ends for you." Rebecca's grip on her weapon tightened. The sirens grew louder, and she knew it wasn't just the police who were coming. Kane had set her up, trapped her right where he wanted her, but she wasn't going down without a fight. In one fluid motion, Rebecca dove behind cover, exchanging fire with Kane's men as the chaos unfolded around her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The gunfire echoed through the warehouse as Rebecca darted from cover to cover, her heart pounding in her chest. Senator Kane's men were relentless, but she had trained for moments like this. She moved with precision, every movement calculated. The sirens were growing louder, but she knew they weren't just the police. Kane had set her up, and now his men were closing in. Rebecca peeked around the edge of a crate, her eyes scanning the room. Kane was still standing there, his cold gaze never leaving her. The weight of his words earlier, "You've just made a mistake, Larson. My people are everywhere," had hit her hard. This wasn't just about the Black Vipers. Kane was running a far larger operation, with his hands in every part of the system. Law enforcement, politics, everything. She needed to end this. She needed to stop him. As Kane's men moved toward her, Rebecca's fingers tightened around her gun. She could hear them muttering to each other, trying to flank her. She wasn't about to let them. With a quick move, she threw a flashbang toward their position, temporarily blinding them with a burst of light and sound. It was just enough to give her the upper hand. She moved swiftly, taking down 2 more of Kane's men as they tried to recover. The others scattered, but she was on their tail, not giving them a second to regroup. Kane was still standing in the middle of the room, looking more like a king than a criminal, as if he truly believed he was untouchable. Rebecca's voice rang out as she advanced on him. "It's over, Kane." Kane raised an eyebrow, a twisted smirk forming on his lips. "You really think you've won, Larson? You've been a thorn in my side, but you're just one person. My empire is bigger than you can comprehend." "Your empire is crumbling," Rebecca said coldly, her gun trained on him. "And I'm the one who's going to burn it to the ground." Kane's face twisted with rage. "You think you can take me down? You don't understand who you're dealing with. I have connections everywhere. Even if you kill me, you'll never escape. You're already a target." Rebecca stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "The only thing that's been a target is you. You've been using the system to shield yourself, but you underestimated me. And now, it's your turn to pay." The warehouse doors suddenly burst open, and Rebecca heard the sound of vehicles skidding to a halt outside. Reinforcements were coming, Kane's last line of defense. But she wasn't finished yet. She wouldn't let him walk away from this. She fired a warning shot near Kane's feet, forcing him to look up from his smug expression. His men were still regrouping, and Rebecca knew that if she didn't move quickly, they'd overrun her. But she had a plan. In the chaos of the standoff, Rebecca quickly activated a small device on her belt. A small but powerful explosive, timed to take out a section of the warehouse's structural supports. The explosion was deafening, sending shockwaves through the building as the walls groaned under the pressure. Kane's face turned pale as the floor beneath him cracked, debris falling around him. "You're crazy!" Kane shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the blast. Rebecca didn't wait to watch the aftermath. She sprinted toward the exit, her heart pounding, knowing that this was her only chance. She heard Kane shouting behind her, but she didn't stop. The police sirens were now a deafening roar, and Rebecca knew she had to be gone before they arrived. Ethan's car was waiting outside, the engine roaring as he slammed on the accelerator and skidded around the corner. The warehouse was coming down behind her, a monument to Kane's downfall. As she jumped into the car, she looked over at Ethan, who shot her a quick, approving glance. "We're not done yet," Rebecca said, her voice steady. "We've got work to do." Ethan nodded, his grip tight on the wheel. "We'll finish it. But for now, let's get you out of here." The two of them sped down the street, the chaos of the warehouse behind them. The sound of the building collapsing was still in her ears, but the real work was just beginning. Kane was gone, but the empire he had built was far from destroyed. The Black Vipers were just one piece of the puzzle, and Rebecca knew that there were more enemies to face, more power structures to dismantle. Hours later, in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town, Rebecca and Ethan sat in a quiet booth, the weight of the night's events settling on them. The news was already reporting the collapse of the warehouse and the death of Senator Kane. The investigation was just beginning, and with the evidence they had collected, it was only a matter of time before the full extent of Kane's criminal empire was exposed. Ethan slid a file across the table to Rebecca. It was a hard drive containing everything they had gathered: wire transfers, names of key players, connections to politicians, law enforcement officials, and businessmen. The Black Viper's reach was vast, and now they had the proof they needed. Rebecca opened the file, her eyes scanning through the documents. It was all there: the deals, the corruption, the web of power that had controlled the city for far too long. But as she read, a realization hit her. This wasn't the end. Kane's empire might have been dismantled, but there were others out there, still operating in the shadows. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his voice low. "This isn't over, is it?" Rebecca shook her head, her expression hardening. "No, but it's a start. Kane might be dead, but the system he built is still alive, and I'm not stopping until it's gone." As the waitress approached with their drinks, Rebecca's mind was already set on the next move. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure the truth was exposed and ensuring that the people who thought they were untouchable would be brought to justice. And no matter what it took, she was ready for the fight. For the first time in a long while, Rebecca allowed herself a moment to breathe. The fight was far from over, but tonight she had won a battle.